Well, everybody, we had on our last episode a couple of concerns, comments, questions, and possibly we misconstrued some things. So the proverbial gloves have come off. We have Mads Kristensen joining us today on this episode of Monsters Weekly. Let's mash on that. Okay, so welcome everyone to Monsters Weekly. This is episode 43. We are pleased to have Mads on the line with us today to come and dispel some of the myths, concerns, questions that we may have around the changes that are happening with Gulp, and as that relates to the project templates that we've got for Asp.Net Core. Mads, I'm sure everyone knows who you are. I hope I said your name correctly. It's Kristensen. That's correct?
Yep, that is correct.
Wonderful. I see it written all the time. You're always introduced as Mads. I just wanted to make sure I was pronouncing it properly. And you work on some plugins and some editors for a little product called Visual Studio. Is that?
Yeah. Well, my proper job is I'm a program manager for the web tooling in Visual Studio, or for some of it at least. And so all the extensions that I write is sort of just something I do as a hobby.
Got you. And the nice thing about that, though, is that you've said before that ends up typically being the kind of the playground and some of the ideas that you're able to execute and build out and kind of maybe even build out the future of what the editors in Visual Studio might be before they're actually part of the product team.
Yeah. So it's a lot of it is actually just that, right? So playground is like, hey, it would be cool if we could have a great story for how to create image sprites. And so how do we do that from a Visual Studio point of view? There are many ways of going about it, but one of them is like an easy way in Visual Studio to maintain and create image sprites and have less than Sass and CSS being produced that you can use in your web projects, for instance. And so that starts out as an extension. I play around with it, see what makes sense, what's the best user experience. And I have a lot of community members then try it out and give feedback, and they can find issues, but also like missing features or features that could be better, like that the user experience might not be as good as it could be. And so I usually iterate for months and months and months with live active users using these things. And then at some point, we figure out, well, this is actually now so good that why not put it in Visual Studio? And so not everything gets in Visual Studio, actually only a few, but it's something that happens. It happened very recently with linters. I had a web analyzer extension that runs Node in the background to run ESLint and CSSLint, TSLint, and CoffeeLint. And that's now in the product. And so that was an example of we actually took the user experience as it was made in the extension and moved it into Visual Studio. So it does happen. Web Essentials is going the same way. Web Essentials is probably my biggest extension, or it definitely is my biggest extension. And we're slowly moving in features, and we have been for years. So those are two examples of when we actually move things in. But a lot of times, why move things in when they're available already for free in the Visual Studio extension gallery that people can just download?
Right, or out on in the general community and things like that. And I just want to say, like we actually started off, I think Simon had started off that last episode by saying, we love Mads. And the reality is we all have Web Essentials installed. I think most developers who are doing anything on the front, like doing anything in web development, have the Web Essentials installed. That's something, the thing that came up for us, and Dave, you pointed it out to Simon and I, were changes to the template. And just to recap for that, Dave, would you mind just kind of covering again the issue that you kind of brought to light?
Yeah, I guess the big change that's happening, my understanding, is that the file new project template from, I guess, the beginning of this ASP.NET vNext journey that we've been on has been using some form of task runner that the Node community probably predominantly was using. So it started out as Grunt, later on it changed to Gulp, and now that's being removed. So now I guess we're moving more towards something that it's some version of the Bundler Minifier plugin, Mads, I believe that is one of your plugins. And is that now being brought into the product itself, or is a dependency on the template? Is there a dependency on the template to this plugin now?
No, the plugin is not being moved into Visual Studio.
Okay.
So the Bundler Minifier. Let me just explain what the Bundler Minifier project is. It's partly part of Visual Studio extension, and that's the people that use it today use it as a Visual Studio extension.
Yep.
And it allows you to exactly bundle and minify JavaScript, CSS, and HTML file. That's all it does, nothing more, nothing less. And that's one part of it, right? The Visual Studio experience. You get right-click menus, you get a lot of tooling support. You even get Task Runner integration, Task Runner Explorer integration, so you can hook things up with certain Visual Studio events. When the project opens, automatically run Bundler Minifier, for instance, stuff like that. The other part of it is the engine itself. So that's actually, so if you think about the Bundler Minifier project, so when I write that extension, it's a solution in Visual Studio. And one of the projects in that solution is the Visual Studio extension itself. Another project is the engine. And that's a class library. And it's also it's actually an executable. It's an XC that is being used from MS Build. Right? So you can hook MS Build up to this as well for CI support, for instance. What we did very recently was we converted that to .NET Core. And that means that we can now call the Bundler Minifier on the command line using .NET Core. Okay, and so what's in the project templates is a NuGet package containing the .NET Core engine of Bundler Minifier in Project JSON under the Tools section. So by bringing that tool in, you can now on the command line write .NET space bundle to run the Bundler Minifier.
So those are implemented just like any of the commands or the tools that are available through things like EF or whatever the case may be. You've got them exposed. We pull them into the tooling section inside the what was the project JSON. I think that we might be moving away from that, but there will be a way to expose those commands to our project, and then that's what enables that command line experience.
That's absolutely correct. So if you want to see how to create a command line tool for .NET Core, then this is a great example on how that's done. So that could be of interest. And then what it does is that in Project JSON, so you import the tool into your Project JSON, and then in your script section of Project JSON, you can hook it up to, for instance, a pre-compile or pre-publish, automatically called .NET Bundle. And so every time you build, it runs the bundle step. So that's what you get out of the box. Okay, that's what the template change is. The addition of those things in Project JSON, the removal of Gulp file.js, the removal of package.js. Package.js is your npm file, right, where you list all your dependencies from npm. Yep. So that goes away too, and the node modules folder goes away. So that's 1,500 files right there, and like 5 or 7 megabytes that disappear from the project template. So instead, you get those things in the project JSON, and you get a new file called bundleconfig.json. And bundleconfig.json is a JSON file where you have the, so there's a little bit in here. So you have input files, output files, and you can determine like these 4 input files should be bundled and minified into this output file, okay? And so you have an array of those input and outputs that you can specify. And you get full intelligence for all that stuff. That's all coming in from the JSON schema that's supported in Visual Studio. Yep. So that's your out-of-box experience with a new template.
And there's support for source maps too, I see, which is great.
Yep. So what happens is that when you open bundle config JSON in Visual Studio, we will show a yellow bar at the top asking you, hey, there's an extension for you that could be helpful here. And it will then prompt you to install the Bundler and Minifier extension. But so it's very important to stress here that the only thing that you get is that JSON file on disk. Yep. And we pull in a NuGet package.
So
okay, and so I was just going to ask quickly here. So you said that you've ported the engine to .NET Core. So we also, one of the concerns, obviously, when this announcement went through and how most of the community understands this as being a plugin for Visual Studio. The concern, of course, is that we've got something that's missing from the experience for somebody who's working on other platforms like Linux or on Mac or whatever. So with the engine porting to .NET Core and it coming in as a NuGet package exposed as a command, it sounds like that's not the case, that this will still continue to work cross-plat.
This is correct. We've tested it on both Mac and Linux, so we're all good. And we added more stuff to that experience. So obviously, when you're dealing with, let's say, Gulp, right, you set up a watch task so that every time you change an input file, it will automatically rerun the tasks that bundles and minifies and does whatever you want, right? So as part of that command line tool that we have, we also have a watch task. So you can run .NET bundle watch, and it finds all your input files in the bundle config JSON, and it starts listening for any file changes in them. Right, so we can give you the full experience. And I see you're on the wiki here. Yep. So if you go to the home, the main page of the wiki, then you can see at the bottom, Visual Studio Code integration. That's actually what I want to show. If you go up, just
okay.
There we go. So here we have an example of VS Code. It could be on a Mac, Windows, Linux, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Visual Studio Code has a way for you to hook up tasks. And so here's an example of how you hook that up. And there's a piece of JSON that you can just paste into Visual Studio Code. And all of a sudden, when you hit build, Control-Shift-B in Visual Studio Code, that is, it will run the Bundler Minifier. It even has the watch task right there. So you can just hit F1 and then write task space watch. Okay. And you're all set to go. Right. So there really is full cross-plat and multi-editor support for this. But if you get the extension for Visual Studio, you get the additional layer of tooling on top that gives you like right-click menus and
that would be this piece here. So everything works out of the box without installing the Bundler Minifier plugin, right? So it would still do the bundling when you build the project because Project JSON has that task that ties it in, or is it part of publishing that it does the bundling?
So it used to be on the pre-compile step, but we're right now moving it to pre-publish. Because really, if you don't have the Visual Studio extension, what you want to do is that you do want to run the watch task, the .NET Bundle watch. Yep. That's your dev scenario. So it doesn't. So having it on build doesn't really matter too much.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So there's lots of great stuff in here, and I think one of our main questions is probably why. Why build this rather than build some cool tooling like this that sat on top of the existing Gulp and NPM pieces?
Right. That is the main question, I guess.
So you mentioned one of them. One of your, or you maybe alluded to it here, is that you eliminated about 5 megabytes from the default project template by getting rid of the node modules folder. Was that one of the big motivations?
No, I wouldn't say there was one motivation to rule them all, like one big, but there was a lot of medium-sized ones. And so one of them was, yes, we do have a lot of files on disk that when you create a new project, that takes longer because we have to put down 1,500 individual files. So that was actually more of a smaller thing. But the consequence of us adding node modules to the Asp.NET Core templates were that a lot of people don't actually care. They don't actually want it. You have to remember that we're not replacing Gulp with the Bundler Minifier. We're replacing System.WebOptimization with Bundler Minifier. We went through Grunt and then Gulp before we're landing on Bundler and Minifier to replace System.WebOptimization. So you have to look at it in that light. So people that were happy using System.WebOptimization, which was the runtime bundling we had in MVC, this is basically for that scenario, right? And they did not want the node tooling, the node modules. And I totally understand why that is, right? I totally understand why we've created a problem that we don't have System Web Optimization for .NET Core. And the solution to that problem is something that people don't necessarily want it, right? Not everyone, at least. And the thing is that when you add something like npm and gulp into your project, then for all the people that don't care and don't want those tools, they now have to understand how they can get rid of them. And it's easy for us here and the listeners that probably is well aware of how gulp and npm works. You just have to delete the files on disk and you're fine, right? And then remove the hooks in project JSON that calls npm install and gulp min tasks, right? But for a lot of people, that is not the case. So so our solution to the problem that we created wasn't necessarily the right one. Now, people that know how to do gulp or Webpack or Browserify or whatever flavor you want of the month of Task Runner out there, they also know how to set it up. So they're not they're not at jeopardy for not, they will still use all the tools that they prefer from the Node.js toolchain, and that's fine. This is about starting out. If you are new to ASP.NET Core, which everyone is, because it is new, right? Then how can we reduce the concept counts and make it easier to understand what's going on and give you a great tooling experience? So that brings me into the next reason why Gulp is not necessarily the right choice. And that is that it's really difficult to tool Gulp because it is just JavaScript and you can do whatever you want. So we don't know what your input files and output files would be if you run Gulp, because it's all JavaScript. It can come from multiple files. It could even be determined by an NPM module that you brought in, what files to use and so on. So we can't give you the tooling experience that gives you right-click menus and so on top of Gulp. We need something more structured, something like JSON, for instance, right? And now we do with bundleconfig.json.
Now you could easily do a Gulp plugin that drives off of some JSON configuration, right?
Well, yes.
You must. I'm sure you looked at that as an option, right?
Oh yeah. And so actually, I have on that wiki, I have a link to how do you actually consume bundle config from Gulp. So if you scroll up to the top, and there's a
to the wiki.
Right. The wiki, yeah. Use from Gulp, and you can see here's an example I did about how can you. So here's the scenario. Let's say that you want the tooling in Visual Studio that the extension gives you, the way that you can right-click and say bundle this, remove this input file from output, all this sort of really handy things that keeps you from the command line, basically, right? What if you want that great tooling experience, but you want to run it through Gulp because you don't want to use whatever minifier that we chose to use. You want to use your own. Also for CSS, you want to use auto prefixer, for instance, right? And you want to run Babel for your JS minification, and so you can write ECMAScript 6 and so on.
Yep.
So here's the example of how can you then consume bundle config so that you still, from your Gulp file, so you run Gulp and Webpack and all this sort of stuff that you want to run, but you use the bundle config JSON that is easy to maintain by hand. It's very easy input-output, right? Or have the full Visual Studio tooling around it. So here you get the best of both worlds.
Right, and so that was actually one of the concerns, I think, Simon. Simon, you've joined the call.
I have indeed.
Wonderful. So that was one of the concerns that, Simon, you had raised about, we've got this set of community tools out there already. Is this just a re-implementation?
Mm-hmm. I was actually really interested in what Matt said about the concept count here. That I feel like that's not true to me. Like, I feel like it's the opposite, that by adding this Bundler Minifier, you've absolutely guaranteed that nobody coming into this project is going to understand the tooling right away. So now they have to learn this Bundler Minifier or understand how to turn it off. Whereas if you just left it as Gulp, then all the people coming in who know Gulp are already in a good place. So you're guaranteeing that nobody is gonna be happy, basically.
Right. So that's a good point. And it was something that we knew when we made the decision. Right. It was a calculated thing for us, saying, people. Here's our reasoning. If you come into ASP.NET Core for the first time, you may or may not know Gulp, but you definitely don't know Bundler Minifier, which actually is not true either, because Bundler Minifier, the extension, have been out there for a year. So a lot of people know that too. 140,000 downloads, right? So that's a lot of people. But You're absolutely right. The thing is, you don't necessarily want to use Gulp. We said use Gulp, right? That was in the template. But you may want to. What if you want to use Angular 2 and then or React JS and you want to run Webpack, right? That's sort of the prescribed way for those projects, or Aurelia for that matter. You may want to run Webpack or JSPM to do the bundling or something like that. And so you don't want Gulp. So this is the case where if you want to use Gulp, you know that's because you've done it before and or have an interest in learning it, so you can set it up. You're going to set it up and it's going to be great. Okay, we have full support in the tooling for Gulp and Grunt for that matter, or Webpack. So that's fine. But for everyone else, understanding a JSON file with inputs and outputs is a lot simpler than understanding Gulp and NPM and how it all works and why you don't need to install Node.js. It's in Visual Studio, and so there's a lot of things to learn there, right? Also, it's not every project that needs Gulp. Like Gulp, in a lot of cases, are, in my opinion, and not just mine, I will say, we hear it for a lot of people, it's overkill. Right? If you are writing a small little website and you want to use minification because you're into Google PageSpeed and you want to make sure that you have a fast website, whatever, right? Then why would you hook up Gulp? Like, what would that possibly give you if all you want to do is bundle and minify? Other than you have to set things up and maintain and run and make sure your CI server has the same version of Gulp that you have, and so on. Or sorry, NPM, right? So I have projects where I do that, and my build script is always like get the latest version of NPM, get all these things. I set up like a whole tool chain of things, and you have to kind of do that if you want like let's say an Advair or Travis CI experience, And so is it needed? I don't know. For a lot of people, it's not, and for a lot of scenarios, it's definitely not.
So one of the things that I do like is how you've broken it out to be something that can be consumed in the build chain as an exe. So that I think is a really good positive. We were touching on that already. What are the plans to keep things updated? Dave, you had some concerns about things like that.
Yeah, I guess it kind of goes back to the history with the web optimization piece, the System.WebOptimization, and like you said, part of this was the problem was that you weren't re-implementing that you'd taken it away and you needed a replacement for it. And I'm glad you didn't just re-implement it, because I do think these steps, the bundling, the minifying, and dealing with your assets, it all makes more sense at build time versus at runtime, the way System Web Optimization works. I think the runtime piece, that's more of an edge case. There are people that need to do it sometimes, but it's certainly
You'd be
better.
surprised.
Well,
you'd be surprised how many people like that they don't have any output artifacts in their project.
Yes. I think they're wrong about that most of the time. But I think there are some content management systems where it's unavoidable and where people are uploading the assets at like after the site is deployed, kind of thing. Where that makes sense. But so one of the
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
One of the concerns, I guess, coming back from the web optimization days is that we were always kind of behind. So as new features or new systems appeared, like LESS and SAS, and the concept of pre-compiling your CSS and things like TypeScript, we were kind of behind the rest of the world. We had bundling and minifying, that's all we had, and it was hard to kind of extend it. There were ways to extend System Web Optimization, and people did plugins for that, but we were always behind the rest of the web development world. And the thing I liked about having Gulp in there, or something that was node-based, was that that's where a lot of that innovation is happening in the web dev world these days with these plugins. And I was excited that in Visual Studio by default we were going to be a part of that. And now the concern is that we'll always be a step behind again.
Right. That's a concern. You could argue, you can make a lot of arguments there. So if the question here, I think, was like, how do we make sure we're up to date?
Yeah.
Is that it? Okay, so So what's under the hood of the Bundler Minifier is this project called Enoglify that you were talking about, was like some third ranking, like not an industry standard tool loader. That was what you said in the previous podcast episode. And what it does is it's a port of AjaxMin for .NET Core. Okay, so AjaxMin has served the .NET community well for many years.
Yep.
And it's actually being actively developed in Enoglify, and it also does HTML minification now, which is great. And so, in terms of being behind, like, there's how many ways is there to minify CSS, right? I mean, that's like, I've done that for 10 years, like with custom regex in the beginning, and that's great, right? But the good thing is that it keeps being maintained and it's getting better. So that's better and better. So that's good. So it's already better than AjaxMin, which is nice. If you want something custom, like let's say you want the Closure compiler with custom settings and whatever, yes, by all means, go Gulp. Right. Go Gulp all the way, right? That's perfectly fine. You have to, I mean, if your needs are beyond what this is, which is totally fair, and it would be in many cases, then you go do that, right? And if you want to do more, if you want to use Gulp, then look at that example I have, how you can combine the two, right? Or completely ditch the Bundler Minifier. The good thing about the Bundler and Minifier is that if you just delete bundle config JSON, it's gone. That's it. That's all you have to do to get rid of it. And so it's really, really easy to to get rid of it and then add Gulp if you want. And there's probably going to be a button very soon that says, when you right-click bundle config, that says convert to Gulp. So there is a grow-up story there.
Okay.
And so when the Gulp file is there, that's the one that's going to take over, and you're going to see Gulp files show up in Task Runner Explorer. You can run the minification tasks and so on. You can hook in your own minifiers, your own node modules to do exactly what you want, right?
I think if that grow up story is there, that addresses a lot of my concerns. My concern isn't necessarily that we're gonna be on some old minifier that doesn't support our needs. Minification is largely a solved problem these days. It's more, how do I grow up into adding more things to my pipeline now, because there are these other plugins that don't exist yet that just came up that I want to use, that are part of the Node or Gulp community.
I would say that there's two ways you will grow up. You can grow out of Bundler and Minifier and do your own stuff. And one is that you don't have, let's say, Gulp today, and you want to take what's there. Either you can start fresh, add a Gulp file.js, add package JSON, and add the node modules that you need, and do it completely manual. That's fine, right? That's always been an option, and that remains to be an option. You can also, very soon, you'll be able to right-click and say, convert my bundle config into a Gulp file. And that will do all that sort of stuff for you, including it will hook up the Gulp file with
build steps,
with all the steps that were in what was in your bundle config to begin with, all the paths, right? So you have the exact same experience with Gulp. You go from bundle and minifier to Gulp, and you're gonna get the exact same experience, but Gulp is running the show. Okay, you still have your input and output files defined, and it does the right thing.
And is that going to be based on what you have in the wiki now for that example of running Bundle Minifier under Gulp?
Yeah, you could imagine that. So if you have any, so the wiki is open, so please help out. If you can help do a better version of that Gulp file, then that would be great. But and that brings us back to the third option, which is you can have Gulp and you can have Bundler Minifier side by side, and your Gulp file consumes the bundle config JSON, just like it does here in what we see on the screen right now. You see line number 6 or whatever, it says bundle config equals require bundle config JSON. So that's an option too, right? So there's plenty of grow up stories here to jump into the Node.js based toolchain or any other toolchain that knows how to read JSON, right? Or doesn't really matter.
Right. So one of the things then is that this does feel, for anybody who's been following along for the last couple of years, and we're gonna have to wrap up here soon. But one of the things looking in the last couple of years has been that it just seems like there's been this massive adoption of, open source things. And I guess for all intents and purposes, Mads, this is open source. It's your open source, but it's no less open source than any other open source. But it felt like there was a stronger support for the tooling that was kind of already out there. This feels like I'm sensing that it's a reasonable compromise to continue using some open source things and to not exclude the open source initiatives, like things like people who want to use Gulp and whatnot. But I also, the concern is that once you've removed it from the template, chances are people aren't going to use it. So unless, in terms of extensions and extensibility, one of the things that Microsoft hasn't traditionally been good about is having these extensibility points out there and then not really having good coverage on how to, how do I spin up this other Angular 2 type thing with Webpack? Like, how do I do those types of things? So is that something that Microsoft is intending to fill in with documentation, or is that something that you feel will just emerge from the community, from bloggers and whatnot as we move forward?
Yeah, I've had people building, let's say, Task Runner Explorer extensions for Broccoli, for instance. So there is one for Broccoli out there that I did not write, and he based it completely off of one of my other extensions for Task Runner Explorer. So all the code is out there for people who wants to dive in and try this. I have, like, my GitHub repo is probably the largest place for how to see how to can do that, and you can just clone it and give it another name and another GUID, and change it to a different file format instead of Gulp file.js. Whatever is the next thing that comes up next week, change it to that, right? And so you're good to go. So we already have like a lot of good stuff out there. So we ship with Grunt and Gulp in the box. I have NPM scripts, so you can run that in Task Runner as well. That's really phenomenal. We have Webpack, we have Brunch, we have Broccoli, and then we have Bundler and Minifer actually uses the same system, and so does another extension I have, which is called Web Compiler, that compiles less than Sass and ECMAScript 6 and JSX and stuff like that.
Cool.
Wonderful. Okay, Dave, anything else from your end?
No, I think maybe before we go, I just had one last question for you, and that was if this generate Gulp file right-click option is coming, when can we expect it?
Next week.
Next week?
Yeah, or
Fantastic.
today.
Or today. I love that answer.
I think that file, I think I can do that. Yeah, that's just going to take
so it would generate this is what you're thinking?
Did you just invent that you were going to do that while you're on the call with us?
No. No, it's actually been something people have been asking for the web compiler extension for the better part of a year. So no, and it's on. I added it like yesterday because I realized I didn't have it as a feature request on Bundler and Minifier, only on the web compiler. Those two extensions are sort of siblings, or the way I thought about it at least was they're siblings. And so no, that's definitely coming. And it will probably just spew out something like this. So if you can help modify this wiki on how that Gulp file should look like, then that's what I will use. And the good thing about Bundler and Minifier, this is actually important from an update perspective. Because Visual Studio 2015 automatically updates extensions, that means that we can release updates to this thing all the time. Like, we don't have to wait for the next version of like Visual Studio Update 3, 4, 5, so on. Yep. No, we can do it from day to day. Like, I can fix a bug, and 3 minutes later, it's pushed out, and everyone will start downloading it automatically through Visual Studio. So you can expect that bugs and new features are going to just show up. Well, not bugs, bug fixes are going to show up.
You can see here that Dave has already forked your repo, and so there's obviously some work here that he's going to do this afternoon. You can expect a pull request by 4, I think. So.
Oh, that's great.
Matt, Mads, we need to wrap up, but I really do appreciate you. We all really appreciate you coming on here and answering some of these questions. We don't envy your position. Whenever you move cheese, someone is going to say the cheese was better before, and so you're not in an enviable position. But we do appreciate you coming on and answering some of our questions, and hopefully that helps to clear some of the questions that are out there in the community up. And having some of this backstory has been invaluable. So we really do appreciate that. Okay. Great.
Thanks for inviting me on. I do have one more thing that if you have 30 seconds.
You bet.
Sure. Okay, so one thing that we can do because we're using the JSON format for bundle config that we couldn't do before is that you can imagine we can have tag helpers in Asp.NET Core or HTML helpers in web forms and the older MVC project types automatically reading the bundle config to produce. When you're in debug mode, it produces the individual script tags, but when you're in production mode or however you want to set it up, it runs the minified bundled version, right? So you can go completely output file less. So you can say, hey, use the min file that's generated on disk. You can also say, hey, I want to suppress all output. I don't want any output from Bundler Minifier at all. I'm just going to use it, just like if it was Gulp, use it from Gulp to produce that. If I use it from a tag helper, for instance, I don't need the output because I can generate that at runtime and then cache it forever while the app is alive, similar to what System.WebOptimization did. But you can mix and match in any way you want. You can have tag helpers that just points to that static resource on disk, or you can have one that generates it on the fly without any output artifacts being added to your project. So it really is that sort of flexibility that we get with a JSON format that there was no way we could do with a JavaScript format like Gulp file.js.
Wonderful.
Very cool.
Okay.
Great.
Well, thanks for that extra tidbit here, and we will see everybody on the next episode of the Monsters Weekly. Thanks, everyone.